Good evening. Welcome to the fourth in our Media Democracy Festival 2020 virtual series. Today we are going to be discussing the ever important and prescient issue of platforms and how to bring platforms specifically within the fold of a genuinely democratic, accountable a media system. And this question is obviously incredibly important at the best of times, but all the more so given that we are now having this form of discussion virtually, and the power that has been vested in platforms has, if anything, increased dramatically as a result of the pandemic. So that is going to be, I think, a key theme of our discussion today. I'm extremely glad and grateful to be joined by a fantastic panel. First, we have, this is not the order they'll be speaking, but just to introduce them, Lina Dencik is a reader at Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Culture. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Data Justice Lab based at Cardiff. She's published 5 books about the media, including most recently our forthcoming co-authored book with Natalie Fenton and Des Friedman called The Media Manifesto. We have Nathan Schneider, all the way from Colorado. He's the professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. Journalist very well known for his coverage of the Occupy movement, amongst other things. The author of several books, including most recently Everything for Everyone, the radical tradition that is shaping the next economy. And finally, we have Alaphia Zoyab. She is senior campaigner at Avaz, where she's spearheaded a number of remarkably successful campaigns in the sphere of media and technologies. I can say she was absolutely instrumental in obstructing Rupert Murdoch's efforts to buy out Sky News, and more recently has led campaigns around online harms, disinformation, hate speech, etc. So, Alaphia, I think we'll start off. I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to give a brief 5-minute introduction to the key themes that they want to speak to in relation to tonight's topic. And that should hopefully leave us with a very good amount of time for open discussion. But Alaphia, since you're absolutely on the front lines of the policy debate and controversies really surrounding online harms, perhaps you could talk a little bit about your work in that area.
Yes, thank you so much, Justin. And it's the mention of the words Rupert Murdoch always puts a smile on my face. Right. Thank you. I'm a senior campaigner at the global campaign group Avaz. And what I'd like to focus on in my 5 minutes today is to share some of Avaz's fantastic and disturbing research on the scale and crisis of disinformation around COVID-19, and then talk through some of the solutions that we think the platforms must adopt and that regulators must force them to adopt. But before I dive straight into the research piece, let me start with a brief background of Avaz's disinformation work and why and how it began. We started a project called the Elves Project. We brought together a team of elves to investigate what the online trolls were up to. And we launched this ahead of the Brazil elections in 2018. And 2 years later, as we sit in front of our screens in the middle of the pandemic, there is good news and bad news. And let me start with the bad news first. As Justin pointed out, the bad news is that big tech has used this crisis to make massive gains and further inroads into our lives without any meaningful protections for us, the users. But the good news is that the world seems to be waking up to the dangers of social media disinformation, much more so in the context of a public health crisis than people did in the context of elections and dangers to democracy. We polled a representative sample of British voters last year and this year, asking the exact same question, which is, should social media platforms be regulated to protect our societies from online harms like disinformation, false news, and data misuse? And last year, 77% said yes, and in February this year, 81% said yes. So there's a heartening increase, and I suspect if we polled today, a few months into the COVID crisis, that number could be higher. Now, in February, the WHO warned of an infodemic around COVID-19. They said fake news travels faster and more easily than the virus, and it is just as dangerous. In response, Facebook launched a publicity blitz claiming that their efforts in tackling disinformation were quick, aggressive, and well executed quite well. So the Avaz investigative team decided to test that claim. What we did was we took 100 pieces of COVID-related disinformation in 6 languages. 65% of those pieces of disinformation had been debunked by Facebook's official fact checkers themselves. But what we found were, firstly, massive delays in Facebook's implementation of its own policies. So, for example, they said they would notify users as soon as something was debunked. But in some instances, it was happening weeks later, days later, and in some instances, weeks later. So to give you an example, there was one viral post which said Black people do not get coronavirus, false, obviously. And imagine that a user has seen that, decides, they don't need to worry about it, drops his or her guard, decides social distancing isn't necessary, and you're quickly down a slippery slope. So what we found was that Facebook was actively, certainly asleep at the wheel, but because of the spread of this disinformation, really failing to flatten the curve, which was the societal effort at the time. These 100 pieces of disinformation had been shared over 1.7 million times and had estimated views of over 117 million. You really can't flatten the curve of an epidemic with an infodemic like this. And I also want to draw the audience's attention to the inequity of your digital experiences and therefore in turn potentially your mental health. So for instance, if you're not an English speaker, your chances of exposure to hate speech and disinformation are much higher. We asked Facebook to issue warning labels on the disinformation content, like particularly on the COVID content. And we found that Facebook had not issued warning labels on 29% of English language content, but for Italian and Spanish, that was over 65%. And we haven't looked at languages like Hindi and Portuguese spoken, by a vast majority of Facebook's users. So it's hard to say, but it's clear that they do a lot of window dressing in English. But depending on which language you speak, you could really be exposed to much more harmful information on the platform or disinformation. So I guess that brings us to what do we do about all of this? So I think we all know the scale of the crisis. This was an example of the scale of the crisis. What do we do about it? Avaz has pursued 2 policy objectives. The first one is to get the platforms to correct the record. So essentially, it's the old journalistic principle sort of translated for big tech, which is you need to actively notify users every time they're exposed to lies on the platform. And people always say, well, who decides what is true and what is not true? I think what we need to do is massively scale up independent fact-checking to be able to support this initiative. Facebook already works with fact-checkers in key countries. That needs to be massively scaled up so that it is an independent effort and there's no ministry of truth. And then the second objective that we've pursued and that lawmakers seem enthusiastic about is detox the algorithm. So the algorithm is the distributor of the content, and platforms can easily downgrade that disinformation from their recommendation algorithms. So for instance, we did a study on YouTube and found that 16% of the videos that were popping up in the related news feature were misinformation videos. Now, YouTube can easily take those out of its algorithm, and once our study came out, they did in fact do that. So in other words, in simple terms, stop giving oxygen to these lies. The warning note I want to strike at this point is, and not that we need more bad news, but the danger ahead is that if big tech doesn't get on top of this problem of disinformation, there's an iceberg ahead. We're seeing, our research shows that the anti-vax movement is already gaining ground, and they've been active on the platform for a long time. What we are starting to see is the anti-vax movement already building a vast army of skeptics to take on, to essentially stop the spread of a potential vaccine when it arrives. And that is the danger, that we think we might be out of this crisis once a vaccine is found. But the vast army of skeptics that social media has allowed on the platforms right now is the worry. I'm conscious that I'm like almost at 10 minutes, so I'll wrap up to say that regulators are really starting to see the crisis. The days of self-regulation are over, and most sensible lawmakers agree, and we need to capitalize on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alaphia. Some sobering thoughts there, and detail about just the sheer scale of the problem that we're facing. As you put it, we can't expect to really beat a pandemic in the face of an infodemic. But also heartening that there clearly is well thought out and well mapped out policy asks and policy demands of lawmakers. And that's often a tricky area when it comes to platforms. And we're often told by politicians and policymakers that it's extremely complex and it's too difficult, or all sorts of things that platforms themselves argue why they shouldn't be the targets of more intrusive and robust forms of regulation. But I want to turn now to Nathan, because it's not getting lawmakers to laws or it's that there is also an awful lot, I think, that can be done in the realm of community governments and self-regulating tools by users themselves. And Nathan, perhaps you could share your thoughts on that. Unless are we having technical problems with Nathan's? Yeah, it looks like we are. In fact, okay. So Nathan, we'll come back to you when we sort that out. But let's move straight on to Lina. Lina is going to talk to us about the particular problem of how actual forms of regulation are being effectively outsourced to private companies. Lina.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll take on, I guess, a slightly different take on platforms than the focus on disinformation and social media, and really speak to this, the way in which platforms are now being embedded in more and more of our social life and our public infrastructure, particularly that has been happening for a while, but has been massively accelerated during COVID-19. And we have seen the state obviously become a very big actor, but doing so very much in partnership with big tech, and big tech coming out as big winners of this crisis in many ways, or certainly becoming seen as also somehow saviors to this crisis that we're facing at the moment. And that's happening in lots of different ways. So in very obvious ways, we obviously have it in terms of the role of big tech in actually directly in terms of healthcare policies. So for example, bringing in companies like Google and Apple to effectively determine how something like contact tracing as a health policy should be carried out on a global scale across governments, by doing so simply by setting standards for how that can operate, and governments having to more or less abide by that. But we're also seeing it in other ways. We're seeing it in companies like Palantir, which is a software analytics company that has been brought in also to sort of in partnership with the NHS to create a sort of data store that will sort of form the backbone of the NHS by collating lots of data and providing intelligence across the National Health Service. But of course, we're also seeing it in terms of our lives moving online and this transition to online, whether that's in education, where we have immediately licensed platforms like Zoom, or the shift to work online, where we've seen a massive boom in employee monitoring platforms in order to make this shift towards working online and finding new ways to measure and assess productivity. We're also seeing it in areas that I've looked at in some work that we've done around social welfare, where now risk assessment platforms or risk assessment tools are being used also in terms of determining risks in relation to COVID, both in terms of health risk, but also in terms of socioeconomic risks as an outcome of COVID-19. So we're basically seeing across lots of these different areas, platforms now effectively becoming the infrastructure upon which we're supposed to understand social problems and find solutions to them. And as I say, this transition was already kind of in place, but has been accelerated by this. And that's not a surprise, considering there would have been pressure on platforms to do good, make good of sort of venture capital, etc., and scale up and make sure that more and more of our social and public life do become dependent on their tools and platforms. So this, the fact that they have managed to embed themselves in so many different areas of our lives is in many ways unsurprising. And I guess there's sort of a number of different important implications of this that Justin's alluded to already in terms of the regulation aspect, but there's sort of interrelated issues, I guess, that I would say that we need to consider with this. One is that these platforms are dependent on data collection and analysis, so these are data extractive technologies. So what we're seeing with the embeddedness of these platforms across these different areas of our lives is a normalization of surveillance, if you like, and that is a key implication of some of this, that this is now was already quite entrenched in our lives, but is becoming even more so, and is really becoming almost impossible to not engage with this, particularly now that it's also so instrumental to how we're going to carry out health policy and healthcare. And that will have consequences for different parts of the population who will perceive of these types of surveillance infrastructures very differently, and it brings in questions of trust and lots of other issues that will have an impact for how people, perhaps, for example, will engage with the health service in future. So this is one key aspect that we need to think about, how these platforms normalize surveillance. But the other important thing is that they're redefining social issues into computational issues. So in many ways, what happens when you start embedding platforms in these different areas of social life is that you are starting to take on the logic of these platforms, that what counts as social knowledge is knowledge that can be quantified and measured, etc., that advocates for ways of managing populations and shaping behaviors in particular ways. So really sort of the aim of these platforms is to change social practices in such a way that suit the way these platforms operate. So we're confronted here with a different way of understanding both problems and solutions once we start relying on these platforms. And then thirdly, and this relates to the regulation aspect, by doing that, we're actually creating or shaping our practices in such a way that we will become increasingly dependent on these technologies. Because once these platforms are embedded within the way in which we carry out social welfare or healthcare or education, etc., they need to scale, and they will want to bring more and more of those types of areas of public life onto their platforms and become dependent on these platforms. And effectively will start displacing what we might think of as public infrastructure or public institutions, and change the nature of those, which in some ways goes beyond just thinking about this as privatization, because increasingly these different areas of our welfare state will become actually dependent on these technological infrastructures, and will sort of pay or become a sort of a tenant of Silicon Valley, if you like, through paying with our data, also paying with licensing, etc. And it hands over a huge amount of power to these platforms to actually be able to determine the terms in which we need to carry out policy and provision in these different areas. So I think that this is a huge challenge if we start embedding these. And some of the information we know about the nature of these companies have only come through campaigning. So Foxglove and others, which is a tech justice NGO, campaign for documentation to come out about Palantir's deal with the NHS, for example. And that deal has only been made transparent because of that campaign. So there's a huge issue with how some of these things are dealt with. And we can certainly try and ask for more transparency about the nature of these partnerships that are being rapidly set up. But I think more fundamentally, we need to ask much more questions about how investment is carried out here. Why is it that public infrastructure is being bypassed to immediately turn to Silicon Valley to provide the infrastructure in these different areas? And that's something that we can do also within, the institutions that we're in, where we're also seeing this kind of knee-jerk reaction to sort of immediately turn to platforms from sort of private platforms in order to continue with life online. And I think we should probably ask questions about the way in which we might, do that differently, and think if we can find alternatives for that.
Thank you so much, Lina. I think a running undercurrent of your remarks there, I think, was this notion of dependency, and I think that's probably resonates with everyone really in terms of our kind of personal day-to-day experience of these technologies, and obviously since the pandemic, the way in which our working lives have evolved. But what's really, I guess, the most concerning aspect of all of this is what you're talking about in respect of the state's structural dependency on these platforms in order to provide some of the solutions to these kinds of crises. And that is, I think, a very good moment to hopefully bring in Nathan if we have managed to resolve the technical issues. I think we have, which is great. So Nathan, what can we do about this? If the state is already, hugely structurally dependent on these platforms, is there any way in which communities can find solutions for themselves?
Well, thank you so much for including me in this, and I'm sorry about the glitches. Partly a result of trying to be less dependent on these tools and using open source operating systems and software sometimes introduces some issues. So thank you for bearing with me. But I want to zoom the conversation into to a different scale. And it's relevant to the conversation we've been having so far, because these platforms are governed in a kind of fractal way, right? In the sense that what happens at larger scales is replicated in smaller scales, and that includes the scales of our online communities. And it's been part of the logic of these platforms since very early on. And if we could share my screen. To essentially outsource the governance of and the moderation of content to users themselves. This goes way back to the 80s and 90s. This is a screenshot of a administrative interface for an early BBS system, a bulletin board system pre-internet, and all the way back to here, but also in the early corporatization of the internet with America Online and related services, platforms were outsourcing their governance and moderation to users themselves. And what kind of governance tools did they enable? Well, governance tools that replicated the kinds of governance that the large platforms themselves were beginning to carry out, a kind of what I call implicit feudalism, where mechanisms of democratic accountability are not like, basic things that, my mother's garden club does, like voting and having a constitution and having term limits, is not available. But in fact, things like autocratic control, removal of speech, and this sort of thing are the main tools of governance activity. And this becomes, I think, all the more important at a moment where we're dependent on these tools for how we constitute ourselves. One thing that my lab at the University of Colorado Boulder has been doing this summer is working with mutual aid groups that have been forming and they're often relying on whatever technologies are at hand, Slack, Facebook groups, the like. And we're working with them on their governance. And one of the things we're noticing, of course, is that they're defaulting to the kind of implicit feudalism that these platforms allow, where often even though these are very radical horizontal groups, often they find themselves after a few weeks or months with one person in charge of everything, no real accountability for that person. And they have to use extraneous tools to figure out, okay, how do we actually want to govern? Now, thinking about this problem in a range of contexts, including online platforms, on social media platforms, as well as online games, has motivated a group that I'm working with called the Meta Governance Project to envision a governance layer for the internet. So this is a really ambitious vision for how to embed really sophisticated governance tools where you could kind of import governance modules like a jury or a petition system or an election or all kinds of things into your online game, into your social media network, into your labor platform. We're working with actual platforms doing all of those things to do this. And all toward this simple vision of an internet where democratic practice is at least as available as autocracy. Now, at this point, this is an extremely complex ambition. We're looking to build an open standard that would enable different kinds of platforms to create these interoperable governance toolkits that would really shift how we think about how we self-govern online, and in turn the kinds of expectations we have of the governance of platforms themselves. In the meantime, my lab and I have hacked up a kind of early prototype using natural language rather than computational modules called Community Rule. And this is what we're using in our collaboration with the mutual aid groups right now, as well as open source software projects and others. And it's a simple toolkit that enables users to create what we call a rule for themselves, a simple kind of constitution. The tool asks you basic questions, you fill it out, and you can publish and share your rules with others. So this is a selection of user created rules. For instance, users have already started learning from each other and actually building rules based on what they see with each other. They're blending the templates that we have available, which are simple kind of governance patterns that we've seen pretty widespread, which then users can take, grab an elected board, for instance, and then customize it and adjust it to the needs of your group, and then you can republish it on your own, either on your own website with an export tool or here on Community Rule. So this is just one tiny step toward a vision in which self-governance becomes much more flexible and dynamic in our online communities, and that users feel the capacity and empowerment to do real self-governance rather than relying on this implicit feudalism, which again becomes all the more important when we are so dependent on our online platforms for how we organize our lives, our workplaces, and our communities. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. That's absolutely fascinating, and it sounds like an incredibly ambitious and prescient project that you're working on. And I think just as a kind of kickoff, really, for the discussion and to abuse my chair power, I'd like to just kind of throw back some of the points you raised to both Lina and Alaphia. I mean, in the Media Reform Coalition, we've always tended to think about, solutions to some of these problems being through the kind of old school methods of, in some ways, of campaigning and lobbying politicians and policymakers and intervening in policy debates. But how much, Lina, if I can come to you first, how much potential, I appreciate you may not be intimately familiar, as I'm not, with the kind of project that Nathan's talking about, but how much potential do you see in these kinds of self-governance tools to deal with the problems that you raised in terms of the kind of ever more embeddedness of platforms and ever more power that platforms have over our lives?
Yeah, I think so. There was massive thunder and lightning happening outside my window, but I do think I most of that. Yeah. Yeah. I think obviously coming up with alternative governance structures that are not have a completely different business model is absolutely key, because a lot of the drivers for the way in which these platforms operate that we see being embedded within the public sector are driven by that business model and operate according to the needs of that. So I think coming up with an alternative way of thinking about governance structure that actually, importantly, will consult stakeholders. And I think this is a key thing, that we are relying on platforms without any consultation from, for example, professionals. So in a sort of social welfare context, we might say that there should be consultation with, say, social workers who should be part of the governance of the platforms that are being used within the social welfare sector. We might say the same for platforms that we want to use in a university, that we should actually, as staff, have some say in how these work and operate. And of course, the issue will always be, I'm guessing also maybe Nathan has some thoughts on that, is scale and how to engage with those kinds of alternative infrastructures in a way that people find to work on a large scale as well, if that is necessary. But I think it's absolutely a crucial step and key to solving some of the issues we're finding with the reliance on these platforms and the way that they work, because they're so often so very crude and reductionist in how they operate.
Absolutely. And Alaphia, if I could just turn to you on this question of specifically on this issue of what you called detoxifying algorithms. And I guess this is one way of another way similar to the kind of the self-governance paradigm, to think about how these tools that we all dependent on in our everyday lives can actually serve citizenship and democratic debate in a much more kind of nourishing and inclusive way. But one of the problems, I guess, is when we do ask policymakers and lawmakers to address these issues, then we, in a sense, are kind of becoming dependent on them to define exactly what counts, for instance, as disinformation, or what are the most problematic forms of disinformation. And I'm conscious that this has been a problem also in the way that Facebook and Google and other platforms have themselves tried to demonstrate their ability to self-regulate by introducing filters and metrics, for instance, that then see traffic to genuine, independent, progressive news sites drop off a cliff. So how do we make sure that actually, when those algorithms are being subject to forms of regulation, that it's being done genuinely in the public interest?
Yeah, let me address the first part of the question first, which is that, yeah, it's a really hairy problem for lawmakers to deal with this issue of legal speech. Disinformation is legal speech. You're allowed to lie. And lawmakers are really scared of, impacting freedom of speech. But what we've been telling lawmakers, and I think it is in the context of COVID, this is making much more sense, is that it shouldn't be the business of government to decide what is true and what is not true. But ultimately, we do need some sort of arbiter of truth, and that should absolutely not be the platforms or government. it should be independent fact checkers who have a reasonable history of, good, robust fact checking. And, we do see that in countries with strong public sector media, like including Britain, that the spread of fake news is slightly lower than, for example, say in America, where it's, there's no FCC really. And so the idea that, who decides what is true and what is not true, ultimately we do need somebody. And in the context of COVID, what lawmakers are starting to see is that, yes, we do need to rely on the science. We do need, our healthcare professionals to be the arbiters of what is true at this point in time and what isn't. So that's the first point. On detox, the algorithm, the problem at the moment is that the more extreme the content, the longer you stay on the platform. It's just as simple as that. And so, and therefore, the more revenue, the more ads the platforms can serve to you, the more revenue they make. So it's as simple as that. And the problem right now is that they're massively profiting off lies, and they have no incentive to slow that down unless they're forced to, for example, in the context of COVID, where lawmakers are telling them, you're literally killing people. These lies are literally killing people. That's why over 2,000 healthcare professionals wrote that open letter, published a full-page ad in the New York Times to the CEOs of social media platforms, essentially saying we can't save lives and fight lies at the same time. It's not possible. And so in the context, like in the COVID has been helpful in the sense that there is at least some sort of clear, like what is true and what is not true, which becomes way harder in the context of political lies. But we are starting, for example, to see Twitter as well move in the right direction, where they labeled one of Trump's tweets as violating their terms of service. So I think what we need is for users to be notified, but ultimately the platforms at the moment are judge, jury, witness, defense, prosecution, all of that rolled into one. And unless lawmakers get us regulation, the asymmetry of power doesn't change.
That's very interesting. I think that all of these all strike me as all very compelling solutions, and I completely agree. There is no other way, to determine standards and certainly, fact checking than those genuinely independent organizations that have built a reputation for that kind of expertise. But one thing that I haven't had really from any of you, and I'll just kind of throw it out there to all three of you. Traditionally, I guess, certainly in the media sphere, when we used to talk about problems to do with concentrated power, which I guess is the kind of common thread in all of this discussion, that usually the solution was, well, you just try and take power away from them. Whether that's through antitrust measures, whether that's through the imposition of levies, or other ways to kind of introduce more competition into the different, the various sectors. Is there any prospect? Do any of you just see any prospect in any kind of measure that really just dilutes both the kind of market power that these platforms have, but also the power over other industries, over governments, and over ultimately all of us? Can we just cut them down to size? Lina?
I mean, I think, there is progress being made on some of this stuff in terms of antitrust, etc. But it's a pretty slow game, I guess. And I think we're also seeing, of course, I mean, I'll be speaking from sort of UK, European perspective, where we're seeing the EU also trying to somehow position itself in some respects as a challenge to some of the very dominant platforms we're seeing. But whether that's, and so are emphasizing things like technological sovereignty, and that the EU needs to have some counter to these platforms that are predominantly from the US and from China. But I think I'm not sure how well that's going to work in practice, and if there is much possibility in that regard. But I do think there is the problem with, if you start looking at it in terms of these kinds of say surveillance infrastructures and data infrastructures, is that a lot of the efforts need to be on things just not being developed in many instances. So, and we are seeing some gains in this respect. So, for example, out of Black Lives Matter and years before that of campaigning, there's been, now an embargo on facial recognition technology by some major players, for example, for law enforcement. And of course, many would say that this is also a strategic gain for these platforms. IBM and Microsoft have both come out and said, and I think Amazon have also said that they're going to stop for some of their tools for some limited time. But that actually comes out of a lot of research that has been done by activists and others. Joe Bilwani at the MIT, for example, who's illustrated the discriminatory impact of this type of uses of data and use of facial recognition tools. So there is sort of gains that can be made to push back on some of these developments. And there is also a tech workers movement that's tried to sort of engage with some of these types of issues. So there are things like that happening amongst movement building as well, that doesn't necessarily have to rely on policy and regulation only, but pressures can come from elsewhere. So I think it'll have to be many different directions in order to tackle this. And I think breaking up these companies would absolutely be a needed thing to do as a thing to do.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sounds like the heavens are opening over Cardiff.
Yeah.
Nathan,
I'm in Bristol actually, and it's raining.
Nathan, in what looks like very sunny Colorado, you wanted to say something about the potential to kind of break up or bring these corporations down to size.
Well, I think it's important to understand that historically there have been different sides to antitrust. It's not just about breaking companies up, and that's important too, but it's also what you enable. For instance, in the generative period of antitrust law development in the United States, not only did we have the Sherman Act and so forth that enabled that kind of intervention, but also the Capper-Volstead Act, which was passed in 1922 with the explicit purpose of enabling farmers to create cooperatives that would be alternatives to this to the power of the urban elites, and to protect those cooperatives from antitrust law. Right now, the ability for people to do a lot of the things Lina was just mentioning, like gig workers organizing, is actually constrained by antitrust law. We need to make sure that we are making intentional protections on the one hand to enable people to come together and create collective power. Currently, if they do that, they are very vulnerable, and we don't often realize the things that the law is preventing because they don't happen. Why is it that we're not seeing Amazon sellers band together against Amazon? It's because when the book publishers tried that, they got hit with antitrust law. And also we need to think about financing. What are we enabling? The current tech economy is built on a venture capital financing model enabled by law, superpowered by a revision in 1979 to the Prudent Man Rule that supercharged Silicon Valley in the decades that followed. This was an intentional form of financing developed. We need alternative forms of financing that support things like federated social networks, that support things that enable power to be more distributed. Currently, we're relying on an economics of centralization, and we're wondering why we're getting so much centralization. If we were to intentionally ensure that groups of people of different kinds are able to access finance to create their own tech solutions, then we would see those other models emerge. We saw that in our country, certainly during the last Great Depression, when the needs were so acute that government created mechanisms for cooperative financing to provide rural electrification, to enable credit unions to spread all over the country. We need an escalation of those kinds of democratic finance if we're going to have the kinds of democratic platforms that we'd like to see.
I think that's I think that's an excellent point. I mean, the bottom-up approach to dealing with concentrated market power and media power, I think, is at least as important, and perhaps even more so in the context of platforms. And there's obvious, clear kind of policy asks to extract from that, including making the financing available, as you suggest, to try and unlock those markets to some extent. Alaphia, I just wanted to come back to you for one last question before I then ask all three of you to just give a kind of very brief sum up. But in terms of, you obviously are a member-led organization, and very much in tune with the degree of kind of grassroots support and strength of support for this kind of social change, really, which is what we're talking about. And I wondered if you could just say something along the lines of what our dear friend and host Thomas asked, which is, how do we build the power to get these solutions implemented? I mean, it seems to me that dealing with the kinds of problems that we're talking about aren't quite as necessarily immediately resonant and obvious to most people as, fighting back Murdoch.
Yeah. And in Avaz's experience, we have a large membership of over 60 million subscribers all over the world. But like even campaigning on issues of disinformation was quite an uphill challenge for us, where it's one thing to have the figure of Rupert Murdoch that people instinctively dislike in the UK, and etc. It's really hard to explain the crisis of disinformation when people think, well, I use social media to chat with my friends, I can dip in and out whenever I like. So it has been challenging to build that kind of public support for these issues and to campaign against big tech. But having said that, there have been, I'd say there have been three things that have worked well for Avaz, for instance. So the first is quite simply building up the evidentiary base. It's like report after report exposing the harms that are being done by the platforms in different contexts, and it's particularly around issues that tend to be bipartisan. So, for example, child exploitation, sexual abuse, and stuff like that. And every now and again in our campaigning, we've been helped by things that happen in the real world. So, for instance, I think the Cambridge Analytica scandal really changed the game and woke people up. So that was one instance. And then in the UK, the tragic suicide of Molly Russell and her father campaigning for these aggressive algorithms to stop pushing this content. So examples like that can have helped campaigners like us have these issues break through to the general public. And then the third is the UK government actually sent out a questionnaire to all the major platforms about the thing that impacts them the most, like what is most hurtful to their image. And not surprisingly, they all said it's negative media headlines. Now that just seems very obvious and like a truism, but working alongside strong partners in the mainstream media that do robust fact checking and are credible, building this evidentiary base, and just like constant investigations, we've seen the game shift in the 2 years that we've been campaigning on it. So starting with people going, what is this thing that we're expected to sign a petition on, to now massive support for regulation.
That's a very comprehensive answer, and an encouraging one as well. I would like to just instead of giving you the blank check summing up, because we are running a little bit short on time. We've had a question from Des Friedman, which I think really would be great to get all of your thoughts on as in place of a summing up. But if I could also ask you to tag onto it just any kind of action that anyone watching this either now or later can take away in terms of whether it's lobbying their MP to do something, whether it's joining some kind of community governance tool, or anything that you can think which would be the key takeaway for action would be really helpful. But to Des's question, which I think goes to the heart of a lot of our discussion today, Lina talks about the state's relationship with big tech, particularly in the midst of the pandemic. How do we ensure a form of regulation that doesn't cement but fragment state power without giving yet more control to big tech? In other words, if regulation ends up, in a sense, taking power away from the state, will the necessary other side of that equation be that ultimately the platforms become even more empowered? Nathan, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really important question. With GDPR, for instance, I think we see an example of a real danger of empowering incumbents. You create complex regulations that are expensive to meet, and instead, I think there's an urge to not just regulate from the outside, and need to not just regulate from the outside, but to create more accountable companies, to build democracy and accountability into these. So, one strategy that regulation can adopt is something like what Elizabeth Warren proposed for our presidential candidate recently, that companies over a certain size have to have worker representation on boards. What if platforms over a certain size had to have user representation that had meaningful power, so that you're building in some teeth, a kind of counterpower akin to what unions have done in the past into these platforms as part of their required structure, so that you're not creating one size fits all rules for everybody, but you're creating accountability on the inside. Second is that financing strategy. My lab is working on building this kind of logic of exit to community, bringing together financing and legal tools to enable companies that really often want to become community owned. We need better policy and tools to enable these kinds of transitions to become just a natural part of how tech companies evolve. And if you want to learn more, or you're part of a company that wants to explore this option, please check out our Media Enterprise Design Lab, and we'd love to work with you. And we're building a cohort of projects that are looking to do this.
That's great. And could you share, or perhaps Thomas could share a link for that? That would be really helpful, and a great first one of our three actions. Lina.
Yeah, I mean, I would sort of be very brief, because I think, Nathan outlined some of the key things that could happen, but also some of the things that we've looked at in the Data Justice Lab, of different forms of civic participation. So a key issue is that a lot of these platforms in the areas that we've looked at, where it does impinge upon the way the public sector works, etc., are being done without consultations of any kind with citizens or with the public. And so we've looked at different ways in which that can be done, whether that's sort of citizen assemblies or citizen juries, for all the faults that there are with those, but that they can be brought in as a way of increasing accountability and negotiations around the purpose that these kinds of platforms should have and shouldn't have, and the way they should be governed, and so forth, but also the establishment of things like community oversight boards that have to approve or disapprove the implementation of new technologies. Or it could be also actually within workplaces, where there is now, I think, increasing suggestions about the way in which the introduction of new technologies or platforms in the workplace need to be consulted as part of collective bargain agreements for those workplaces that have union representation. That could be a way to, again, make sure that actually stakeholders who are being asked to become dependent on these platforms have a say in terms of whether that is appropriate to introduce these platforms in these different contexts, and then also the limits of what they should be and how they should operate. So there are different approaches there in that regard.
Great. and a key action for users, viewers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess it would be, at the moment, I actually think some of the stuff around, so just to mention that campaign around the NHS and the deals, that's still ongoing to push back on the government, actually effectively making these agreements in secret, more or less, and to push for some transparency and some questioning around those partnerships, because they will stay in place after this pandemic is over, that's for sure.
Great. We'll share a link to that as well.
Yeah.
And Alaphia.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that much to add to what Lina and Nathan have said. And from the perspective of ours, which is focused heavily on disinformation, our concern is that you get bad regulation and things actually get worse. So for example, there are so many laws around the world which criminalize disinformation and so seriously impact your freedom of speech, freedom of thought even. And so that is something to really watch out for. And that's a growing concern, that governments take disinformation, the crisis of disinformation, and criminalize free speech. And that's something we will continue campaigning on. In terms of a key takeaway from what we have seen is that both platforms and lawmakers need that evidentiary base. So if you're a user of social media and you see hate speech or whatever, disinformation, take screenshots, flag it to the platforms, track your user experience and evangelize. Even if you're a fly on the wall, which I am as a social media user, there's a study which says that 70 likes on the platform likely knows you better than your colleagues do, and with 300 likes, the platform likely knows you better than your spouse.
And that's a great line to finish off. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more questions on this occasion, but needless to say, this is a conversation and a discussion that is going to continue, and hopefully next time in a much more physical, face-to-face environment. I'm extremely grateful once again to our three panelists for joining us from Colorado, Bristol, and London. But also want to say thank you to our fantastic backstage heroes, Thomas Barlow and also Vicky Lewis for making all of these incredibly valuable virtual versions of what was supposed to be a magnificent media democracy festival, and of course to the Media Reform Coalition. Please do get involved, join the mailing list if you aren't already, mediareform.org.uk. Thanks very much, everyone.